You might think pirates spent most of their time brawling with cutlasses swinging or hunting for buried treasure on sandy islands. Sure, that's the Hollywood version, but their biggest enemy wasn't rival crews or the Royal Navy bearing down on them with cannons blazing. Nope. Their real fight, the one that made or broke a voyage, was against something way less glamorous: thirst, fresh drinking water, specifically how to get it. Let me tell you something unbelievably wild about how pirates, those rum-loving scoundrels, figured out a way to turn the dirtiest, saltiest ocean water into something even halfway drinkable. And trust me, the solutions they cooked up were as clever as they were disgusting and sometimes downright hilarious. Here's the setup. Picture a typical pirate ship in the early 1700s, say the notorious Queen Anne's Revenge with its 100-odd men aboard. These salty dogs needed upwards of 50 gallons of fresh water every single day, just to keep from turning into walking barrels of dehydration. That's right, for a crew of, say, 100 men. That's roughly 5,000 gallons of clean water for a month-long journey if they were lucky. Problem was, their ships weren't exactly equipped with modern plumbing or water purification systems. Instead, their fresh water supply came in barrels hauled from ports before setting sail. Stale, heavy barrels buried deep in the ship, no sunlight, and often tainted with the last voyage's fish and worse. So after just 24 to 48 hours at sea, the water turned sour, full of all sorts of delightful ocean crud like algae, bacteria, and occasionally, the eerie presence of mysterious floating worms. Because nothing says fearsome pirate like gulping down water that looked like it moonlighted as a swamp. So why not just drink seawater? Well, spoiler alert, it didn't work. The salt content in seawater is roughly 3.5% by weight, which, to put it into perspective, is about equivalent to swallowing a mouthful of rock salt every time you took a sip. Drinking seawater actually dehydrates the body faster, because your kidneys have to use more water to flush out the salt than you gain from drinking it. Let's just say it wasn't pretty. Pirates who made this mistake would quickly become parched, their mouths turning to sandpaper and their insides turning traitorous, leaving them weak and sometimes delirious. That's one way to ruin your fearsome pirate reputation, going down not in a blaze of glory, but because you confused ocean water for a refreshing drink. Now what about collecting rainwater? Seems simple, right? Pirates did try that trick, setting up canvas tarps and rigging to funnel fresh rainwater into barrels. But storms at sea bring salty spray, seaweed, bird droppings, and all kinds of floating nastiness. Imagine trying to slurp down water that tastes like a mix of ocean brine and seagull surprise. Not exactly a thirst quencher. Plus, rain is unpredictable, showing up in fits and starts. Sometimes they get lucky with a downpour, filling their barrels fast. Most times, not so much. And after a few days without a decent shower, the decks were stickier than a tavern floor at closing time. So rain collection was a hope, but definitely not the solution. Bad idea number 2, distilling seawater over open flames. Theoretically genius, right? Heat seawater until it evaporates, capture the steam, and voila, fresh, salt-free water. Pirates tried to rig distillation setups using kettles and metal pans over small fires in the ship's galley. Here's the catch. It required fresh wood or coal, which was in short supply and precious for cooking and warmth. On top of that, the apparatus was bulky and dangerous on a rocking ship. Fire meets flammable tar and rope is a recipe for disaster. More than one captain learned this lesson the hard way when a makeshift still exploded mid-voyage, sending a cloud of steam, salt spray, and screams throughout the ship. You can probably guess how that ended: charred sails, pissed-off men, and a sudden shortage of drinking water. Let's be honest, pirates were not exactly engineers. Their solutions until this point were either denied by science or ruined by reality. But pirates are nothing if not clever survivors, and here's where it gets interesting. They accidentally stumbled on a primitive form of what we today call solar distillation. Imagine setting up large, flat pans of seawater covered with transparent sails or glass sheets, angled just right to catch sunlight. The heat would evaporate the water inside, which then condensed on the underside of the glass and dripped down into clean catch basins. Not exactly a modern water treatment plant, but pretty close given the era. This method was slow and only about 70% effective. But hey, thirst is a powerful motivator. Pirates likely learned this technique through trial and error because, before science told them why, they just noticed that water collected under a glass was less salty and better tasting than the sea itself. Cue pirate versions of mad scientists hunching over glass trays like it was their treasure map. One legendary example comes from the Caribbean circa 1718 aboard the ship Revenge, commanded by the infamous Captain Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. His crew faced a month-long voyage fighting Spanish ships and dodging storms, running dangerously low on potable water. They rigged a solar still using bits of broken glass, scavenged from a wreck and stretched sheets of canvas painted with pitch to capture condensation. It was not pretty. Imagine scrubbing bird droppings off glass while getting sunburned and bitten by mosquitoes. But it kept them hydrated enough to keep the cannons firing and the rum flowing. Story goes Blackbeard's men called it their magic water trap, though there were plenty of jokes about it being more of a monster mucus catcher. Still, it was better than dying of thirst or drinking seawater, so cheers to that. Meanwhile, in another corner of the pirate world, the Mediterranean corsairs had their own take on water rationing and desalination. Since their ships were smaller, usually crews of 30 to 50 men, they focused more on strict rationing combined with creative storage. They'd sometimes mix the limited fresh water with diluted vinegar or citrus juice, extracted from lemons and oranges they kept fresh in the hold. Besides improving taste, the acid helped inhibit bacterial growth, sort of like a primitive water sanitizer. In a way, these pirates were doing what we do today when we add chlorine or iodine tablets to purify water on camping trips. Fun fact, the citrus also helped prevent scurvy, so pirates were accidentally killing 2 birds with 1 lemon. You'd think they'd sing songs about that, but no, their shanties mostly focused on vengeance or the size of their booty. Pirates also had to contend with their own ship's architecture when it came to storing water. Barrels, usually oak or sometimes pine, could hold around 63 gallons of water, heavy as all gets out once full. The problem? Wood is porous, and barrels were reused for everything from salted meat to wine. If not properly cleaned and sealed, those barrels became breeding grounds for bacteria, fungus, and all sorts of microbial mischief. Pirates tried washing barrels with seawater or even urine to clean them, which sounds like a bad joke, but was a real practice in desperation. Bad idea, really bad idea. Urine's salt and ammonia content might kill some bacteria but would leave a horrifying smell and taste. Tasters reportedly called it the drink of the damned, which, considering the alternatives, might have been poetically accurate. One might wonder why pirates didn't just scoop water from puddles or freshwater springs when they stopped on islands, right? Well, those options existed but only briefly and in limited amounts. Coastal freshwater sources often were contaminated by runoff, animal waste, or worse. Pirates had a saying, better a belly full of brine than a belly full of rot. And they were not wrong. Drinking from a stagnant puddle or swampy lagoon often led to dysentery, a favorite ailment of sailors from time immemorial and a much faster killer than thirst. So this was a lose-lose choice, salty dehydration or death by gut fire. That puts a whole new spin on choosing your poison. Then there was the old sailor trick of heating seawater to cause distillation over makeshift apparatus using empty cooking pots and funnels. But these were notoriously inefficient and risky. The fluctuating temperatures on deck, rain, and the constant motion of the ship meant the apparatus often leaked or collapsed. Plus, connecting the evaporation and condensation chambers with metal or wood tubes that didn't leak salt water was a nightmare without modern soldering or seals. One pirate captain made the mistake of using a leather hose that swelled and burst mid-distillation, spraying salt water right into the fresh catch basin, ruining the whole batch. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation by turning your water source into an ocean spray bomb. But perhaps the most fascinating tidbit is that pirates, without a clue about molecules or chemistry, were repeatedly reinventing desalination techniques based purely on survival instincts and keen observation. When they noticed moisture forming on the underside of sails, or even on the ship's windows during early morning hours, they started collecting that condensation for drinking. It's basically the same principle modern farmers use to harvest dew in arid climates today. Pirate ingenuity wasn't just about avoiding the noose. It was about keeping their salty throats moist enough to sing terrible sea shanties. And yes, shanties that often included lines about the foul taste of their water or the monstrous bellyaches that followed too many watery mistakes. So there you have it, a quick look into the nasty, tricky, and downright creative ways pirates wrestled with seawater. But hold on, these crude methods weren't the final answer. The real breakthrough came from an unexpected place and involved an unlikely combination of nature, science, and a pirate's stubborn will to survive. That story, well, that's just around the corner. Until then, just remember, a pirate's worst enemy wasn't a cannonball but the desperate, sticky, salty curse of thirst at sea. And no amount of rum could fix that. Here's where it gets interesting. Despite all those disastrous ideas, pirates actually stumbled upon another nifty trick that supplemented their ever-meager water supplies. Collecting dew. Yup, that's right. Those rough and ready seafarers learned to harvest the tiny droplets that form on sails, ropes, and even their own clothes in the cool early mornings. Scientists today call this dew harvesting. But pirates simply noticed that when the sun crept up, fresh little beads of water would gather overnight. Ingenious, right? Dew might only add a fraction of a gallon per day for 100 men, but in the endless thirst game at sea, every drop counted. Now, don't get too excited. It wasn't like pirates woke up every day with bowls of dew ready to chug. Collecting dew was manual, tedious work. They'd wipe down the sails or rigging with cloths and then squeeze the moisture into containers. But considering they were often scraping the bottom of the hydration barrel, this slimy, barely their method helped stave off dehydration, just enough to keep a few tongues moist. Think of it as the 17th century pirates' version of bottled water, if the bottle was a sopping rag and the water tasted faintly of sea salt and sweat. Gross, yes, but hey, better than nothing. That little piece of survival wisdom was less about fancy science and more an observation of nature doing what nature does best, cycling water through evaporation and condensation. Pirates didn't know about molecules or humidity, but they sure knew when their hands felt clammy or their ropes glistened in the dawn and acted fast. It's fascinating because nowadays, in places like arid deserts, communities have developed dew harvesting devices specifically to collect this moisture as a reliable water source. Pirates were, quite literally, proto-geographers and environmental engineers winging it on the high seas. Meanwhile, back aboard the ships, another battle raged. How to store water long-term without turning it into an undrinkable science experiment. Barrels were the default, but without modern sealing techniques, saltwater leaked in and bacteria set up camp. Pirates tried everything short of witchcraft to stop contamination. Fun fact, some captains insisted on soaking barrels in lime juice or wine before storing water. The idea was the acid would kill off bugs or purify the vessel, though often it just left a weird aftertaste that made the men grumble and guzzle more rum to wash it down. Good call, pirates. They knew that if the water tasted awful, the rum better not. Now, here's an odd twist. Some pirate crews experimented with smearing the insides of barrels with beeswax or pitch, basically thick, sticky tree sap, to seal leaks and reduce the porosity of wood. It wasn't perfect by any means. Barrels still wept, and wax or pitch tended to degrade with time, but this primitive waterproofing extended the life of their water stores. Think of it as the ancestor of the plastic lining in your everyday water bottles, only much messier and stickier. The downside: if the seal wasn't right, bits of wax or pitch flakes would loosen and end up in the water like accidental sea seasoning. Pirates developed a special knack for spitting those flakes out, often with a healthy curse aimed at the ship's carpenter or their luck. Of course, even if you've mastered collecting dew, sealing barrels, and solar distillation, there was still one giant water mystery hanging over pirate heads: the chemistry of salt removal. Pirates had no periodic table, no idea what sodium or chloride ions were, but they did know salt ruined everything, from food to water. They discovered, somewhat accidentally, that boiling seawater in a tightly covered pot would produce steam that, once cooled on a metal lid or funnel, would drip down as fresh water with no salty sting. Voila, primitive distillation in action. This process, which could turn salt water into potable water at about 75% efficiency under the best conditions, became a lifesaver during desperate times. That said, the implementation was anything but smooth. On cramped pirate ships, kettles and makeshift distillers took up precious space, and required constant tending over fire. No small feat with clanking chains, rolling waves, and a crew who'd rather be swinging cutlasses than babysitting water apparatus. Blackbeard's own quartermaster reportedly burned his hand trying to manage one of these crude stills, and was met with nothing but laughter, and that's what you get for mixing science and piratehood. Still, some captains came to depend on distillation rigs, especially on longer voyages or when fresh supplies were scarce. It's a step up from dew, sure, but still miles from clean water flowing out of a tap. And here's a twist for you. Drinking rum actually helped pirates avoid some water-related illnesses. Rum, being a high-proof spirit, was sometimes mixed with the limited fresh water to help preserve it and kill bacteria lurking in those murky barrels. Now, before you imagine pirates happily guzzling straight alcohol all day, remember that too much rum dehydrated you even faster, so there was a delicate balance. This concoction, often called grog, was diluted enough to taste worse than straight seawater, but better than the swampy water barrels. Grog had about a 25% success rate in keeping pirates hydrated without them turning into shriveled husks of salt. The kicker: the naval officers hated it, calling it the devil's drink, while pirates embraced it as a necessary evil on par with eating gruel. That is, until they ran out of grog and had to switch back to questionable water. Rationing water was yet another tool pirates wielded with grim determination. On ships like the infamous Witta, with roughly 150 souls aboard, water supply managers, usually the ship's bosun or a trusted junior officer, dished out daily portions, often just a pint or two per man. That's about half a liter, barely enough for swallowing dry bread or quenching serious thirst, especially under the blazing sun of the Caribbean. Pirates balanced on the edge of dehydration while putting on a tough front, but sometimes even strict rationing failed. Rumors tell of mutinies sparked by water shortages, with fights breaking out not because of gold or glory, but over a few sips of spilled water. Really puts the mutiny into perspective, doesn't it? With all these desperate tactics, you might imagine the end of the 17th century marked the peak of pirate water woes. But oddly enough, desperation drove innovation. Some pirates began to trade precious loot or gold for fresh water at every port, feeding a small but growing water trade economy that today's historians call the pirate water boom. Merchants and islanders quickly cottoned onto this demand, charging exorbitant prices for water barrels and even inventing makeshift freshwater tanks lined with leather to prevent spoilage during transport. It was like the first bottled water market, except dirtier and with more sword fights over delivery schedules. Before you get too comfortable, here's a fun little side note. Pirates had to battle not only thirst and salt, but also the joy-killing microbial villains brewing in these barrels. Smallpox, scurvy, dysentery. These were rampant, worsened by bad water but not directly caused by salt or dehydration per se. Still, drinking spoiled water was a fast track to illness and death, so pirate doctors often recommended boiling water, even if they didn't fully understand why it worked. Boiling was a magical solution that removed some nasties and made the beverage marginally safer, though it didn't fix salt content. Pirates saw this as a win because a crew dying of disease between battles didn't put gold in anyone's pockets. Speaking of scurvy, the notorious black spot of pirate health, fresh water scarcity indirectly fed this killer. Because they rationed both water and fresh fruits, sailors often lacked vitamin C, the essential scurvy-fighting hero. The citrus fruit workaround used by Mediterranean corsairs later spread among Caribbean crews, where naval surgeons started recommending lemon juice rations. Pirates, stubborn as always, adopted this partly to avoid the misery of bleeding gums and rotting flesh, and partly because the sour juice masked the taste of their water disasters. So drinking something acidic wasn't just a picky palate choice. It was survival science in the making, sneaking up under that rough and ready pirate bravado. At the end of the day, what's truly amazing isn't just how disgusting or awkward pirate water solutions were. It's that they even managed to stay afloat for months at a time, thirst gnawing at their guts and the blazing sun sucking moisture out of the air. From scavenged glass distillers to dew-catching rags, from barrels waxed with tree gum to rum-laced grog, pirates combined hardcore ingenuity with sheer stubbornness to keep the ocean's cruel saltwater at bay. So next time you fantasize about a pirate's life, Remember, it wasn't just the gold or gunpowder that kept them alive. It was the bloody battle against thirst itself, fought with rags, glass panels, beeswax, and sometimes sheer dumb luck. And for those thirsty swashbucklers, that was the real treasure. Here's where it gets really wild. Pirates somehow figured out that the ocean wasn't just a salt soup they had to tolerate, but a resource they could coax fresh water from. If only they were patient and a little inventive. The real genius was adapting what we now call solar stills, but with a pirate flair that involved broken glass, pitch-coated canvas, and whatever scrap metal they could scavenge between battles. Turns out, by trapping the sun's heat inside these contraptions, seawater evaporated, leaving its nasty 3.5% salt behind, and the steam condensed on cooler surfaces, trickling down as drinkable water. Not exactly a modern water treatment plant, more like a pirate's version of a humidifier crossed with a rain catcher. But it got the job done about 70% of the time, which, at sea, is practically a miracle. Now, the catch was slow drip meant slow drinking, and you had to babysit these makeshift stills constantly. One famous story involves Blackbeard's revenge fleet in 1718. After weeks at sea, the crew was parched and grumbling louder than the ship's timbers in a storm. They cobbled together a solar still from shattered glass bottles and sheets of canvas coated in tar to keep them waterproof. Picture a bunch of burly pirates squinting through bird droppings on their magic water trap, while swatting mosquitoes that had settled on the sticky pitch. Sure, the water tasted like it went through a medieval chemistry experiment, but at least it was free of wiggling worms and salt crystals. Legend says they called it their monster mucus catcher, which sounds gross, but kept their tongues moist enough to keep up. The raucous sea shanties, or what passed for singing after a few rounds of grog. Speaking of, grog deserves a shout-out here because it was more than just a pirate party drink. It was a defensive weapon against dehydration and disease, mixed with fresh or at least semi-drinkable water. The rum's alcohol content helped kill off bacteria lurking in those suspect 63-gallon barrels full of questionable slop. The blend was often 1 part water to 3 parts rum, which meant pirates drank less water but got a slight buzz. A win-win until somebody got a bit too enthusiastic and forgot that rum actually worsens dehydration if you overdo it. Naval officers hated grog, calling it the devil's drink, but pirates embraced it with a grin and a shoulder shrug. Sometimes it was less about pleasure and more about survival, because a watery barrel on its own was more likely to host a microscopic apocalypse than quench a sailor's thirst. And let's not forget the Mediterranean corsairs, pirates of a slightly different breed. Their ships were smaller, crews in the 30 to 50 range, which made water rationing a tighter game, but also brought a curious innovation, mixing fresh water with lemon and orange juice stored carefully in the hold. That citrus wasn't just for taste, though it certainly made the grog less like drinking seawater with a splash of garbage. It actually inhibited bacterial growth thanks to its natural acidity. This was basically an early form of water purification, way ahead of its time, even if those pirates had no clue about microbes or pH levels. Bonus, the vitamin C fight against scurvy. So not only were they battling thirst, but they also addressed a killer disease without realizing they were doing something smart, all while grumbling about the sour taste masking their whiskey sweetness. You might think pirates would be composing odes to their citrus saviors, but nope, the greatest pirate songs remain about loot and revenge. Now, imagine this. All these attempts hinge on water storage, which meant barrels, 63 gallons, wooden heavy, and way less hygienic than a modern water bottle. Pirates used what they had. Oak and pine barrels reused endlessly for salted meat, wine, and water. But here's a dirty little secret. Wood is porous, and barrels were notorious incubators for bacteria and fungus, turning precious water into a microbial soup over time. Pirates tried some really weird solutions, like washing barrels with seawater or, wait for it, urine. Bad idea, really bad idea. Urine's mix of salt and ammonia could kill some bugs but left behind a smell and taste so foul that drinkers called it the drink of the damned. Imagine guzzling something that tastes like sweat, salt, and betrayal all in one gulp. That's pirate hydration for you. Yet, desperate times called for desperate measures. Turns out, even the worst options beat nothing at all. You might wonder why pirates didn't just stop at islands and fill up from freshwater springs. Well, those sources existed but were often hazardous. Stagnant pools, swamps infested with bacteria, or polluted by animal droppings. Pirates had a saying, "Better a belly full of brine than a belly full of rot." And they weren't joking. Drinking from contaminated sources often meant dysentery, the #1 killer of sailors back then, way deadlier than cannonballs. So the choice was awful either way. Drink salty seawater and risk dehydration and madness, or gulp nasty freshwater and risk a voyage cut short by a raging gut. Talk about a lose-lose situation. This is why pirate doctors had a grim reputation. They might patch up a missing limb, but no one had a fix for bad water. The old sailor trick of boiling seawater to capture steam wasn't just a semi-successful hack, it was a lifesaver. The process involves heating salty water in a covered pot, causing steam to rise and condense on the lid or a funnel, then dripping down as fresh water. The catch? On a rolling pirate ship with limited space, kettles and distillation rigs were temperamental and hazardous. One infamous mistake involved using a leather hose to channel steam, which swelled and burst, showering the whole galley with salty water and forcing an emergency mop-up while the cook swore off science forever. Pirates were no engineers, and their lack of soldering skills or proper sealing materials made these early stills leaky and frustrating. Yet some captains leaned heavily on these setups during long voyages, making constant maintenance part of daily life. Efficiency topped out around 75% when conditions were perfect, which wasn't often. Here's the ironic twist. Pirates never really understood the chemistry behind salt removal. They had no idea what sodium or chloride ions were. They just knew salt ruined everything: the food, their teeth, their water. That magic steam was just science happening without a lab coat or test tubes. Some crews observed that steam condensed on the ship's windows and ropes overnight. So they began collecting dew and condensation by hand, wiping with cloths to squeeze drops into jars. That's right, pirates harvesting dew like proto-environmentalists, except their version involved salty rags and grumbling men, rather than fancy fog-catching nets. Dew harvesting was slow and tedious but crucial. Even a fraction of a gallon per day could make the difference between staggering dry-throated men and barely functional crew. Imagine early mornings with pirates squinting at glistening sails, swatting away mosquitoes, then squeezing soggy cloths into barrels with the enthusiasm of someone trying to wring out a wet dog. Not glamorous, but effective enough to keep men hydrated when all else failed. Modern researchers call it dew harvesting and have turned it into high-tech equipment in desert regions. Pirates were basically winging it with smelly rags and thick gloves. Dew water had its own taste, a hint of sea salt and sweat, which made it an acquired flavor. Still, it was better than tasting the salt in seawater or worse, the remnants of old barrel goo and pitch flakes. Back to barrels. Some pirate carpenters attempted crude waterproofing by smearing the insides with beeswax or pitch, sticky tree resin, to reduce leaks and wood porosity. This was the 17th century equivalent of lining your plastic water bottle, except much messier and often flaked off into the water, giving it a faint pine or tar aftertaste. Pirates became expert at spitting out these flakes mid-drink and cursing the carpenter responsible, proving that even hardened buccaneers have a delicate palate when it comes to rogue wax bits. These semi-waterproof barrels extended water's shelf life by days sometimes, which was a big deal given their fragile supply. Let's talk about rationing, because hydration isn't just about making water, it's about not drinking it all before your next port call. On legendary ships like the Whydah, with around 150 men on board, a ration of just 1 to 2 pints per day per man was the norm. That's barely enough to wet your whistle, especially under a blazing Caribbean sun. Water managers, usually the bosun or a junior officer, had the unenviable job of doling out these precious sips, often met with grumbles and outright mutiny threats. Stories survive of fights breaking out not over treasure, not over gunpowder, but over a spilled cup of water. Pirates swore on their hooks to protect every drop because, let's face it, you don't want your crew wasting arrows or swords on a water squabble. As if thirst wasn't enough, pirates sparked what historians now call the pirate water boom. They started buying up water barrels at every port, turning fresh water into a hot commodity. Merchants and islanders were quick to cash in, setting ridiculous prices and inventing lined water tanks made from leather to better preserve water during transport. Think of it as the first bottled water market, but with an extra shot of piracy and a side of occasional sword fights over delivery. Pirates gladly traded gold for a chance at good water, proving that not all treasure glimmers, it sometimes gurgles. And before we wrap this up, here's a little medical gem. Pirate doctors often told their crews to boil water before drinking, even if they didn't know exactly why. Boiling killed some of the nasty microbes, causing dysentery and scurvy, a killer combination when mixed with bad rationing and salty conditions. Though boiling didn't remove the salt, it marginally improved safety. Pirates might have been rough around the edges, but they knew a hot pot worth its weight in gold. This was the 17th century's version of just wash your hands, a simple act saving more lives than a dozen cannon volleys. And finally, let's come full circle to the disease pirates feared most: scurvy, the silent killer caused by vitamin C deficiency. Because fresh water and fresh fruit were both scarce, pirates often suffered horribly from bleeding gums, rotting teeth, and terrible fatigue. The citrus workaround from Mediterranean corsairs spread among Caribbean crews and soon became mandatory. Lemon juice rations were a thing, and pirates grudgingly obeyed because they preferred rotting gums to slow death. Sour, but it worked, making pirates some of the earliest vitamin C experimenters, without realizing they were doing cutting-edge nutritional science dressed in bandanas and leather boots. So there you have it. Thirsty pirates wrestled with seawater, sour barrels, dew-soaked rags, and makeshift solar stills, all while trying not to keel over from dehydration or drink themselves to oblivion on grog. It wasn't just boisterous sword fights or treasure hunts that defined their lives. The silent, sticky, salty battle against thirst shaped how pirates lived and died. Next time you picture your favorite cutthroat raising a mug of rum, remember it's not the rum that kept him alive, but the gritty, grimy ingenuity to turn a salty nightmare into a barely drinkable lifeline. That, my friend, was the true treasure of the high seas.